The room smelled like polished wood and tension. I sat across from Ayatollah, my sister, while the lawyer adjusted his glasses and read our father's will. Her nails clicked against the mahogany table in a steady rhythm that sounded almost like a warning. Mine stayed still on my lap, folded together the way my father had taught me when I was nervous. The ceiling fan hummed softly above us, stirring the air that felt too thick to breathe properly. To my son, Adeyemi, and my daughter, Ayatollah, the lawyer read in his measured voice, I leave my estate and savings to be shared equally between them. For a second, everything was completely silent except for that soft hum of the ceiling fan. I glanced at Ayatollah, expecting relief, maybe even a moment of shared grief for the man we had just buried 3 days ago. Then she laughed. It wasn't the sound of joy or even surprise. It was disbelief, cold and sharp. She turned to me slowly, her smile thin as a razor's edge. Equal? You've got to be joking. Her voice carried that familiar tone I had grown up hearing, the one that was half sweet honey and half deadly venom. The lawyer kept reading, pretending not to notice the shift in the room's atmosphere, but her eyes stayed locked on mine like she was sizing up an opponent. You didn't earn that money, Adeyemi, she continued, her voice rising just slightly. You moved away to that small apartment downtown. You weren't even here when Dad got sick. I swallowed hard. My mouth went completely dry. She was lying, and she knew it. I had visited our father every single week during his illness. I had called him every day, sometimes twice. I had sat by his hospital bed reading to him when he couldn't sleep, holding his hand when the pain got too bad. But that was how Ayatollah worked. She rewrote history until people started believing her version instead of the truth. She had been doing it since we were children, telling our parents I had broken things she had shattered, claiming I had started fights she had provoked. And somehow, people always believed her because she delivered her lies with such absolute confidence. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mr. Adeyemi, please sign here to confirm the acknowledgement of your share. He slid a document across the table toward me. I reached for the pen, but Ayatollah's hand shot out fast as a snake, stopping the pen before my fingers could touch it. Maybe we should reconsider what equal actually means, she said, her smile widening into something that looked almost predatory. The lawyer hesitated, his pen frozen midair. I felt something cold slide through my chest like ice water, the first crack in the fragile peace I had carefully built around my father's death. In that quiet office, with the afternoon sun filtering through Venetian blinds and casting striped shadows across the polished table, I realized something important. This wasn't about the money. It had never been about the money. This was about control, about power, about Ayatollah needing to win even when there was nothing to win. She had always been competitive, always needing to be the favorite, the successful one, the one everyone admired. Our father had loved us equally. I knew that in my heart. But Ayatollah had spent her whole life trying to prove she deserved more love, more attention, more of everything. And now, even in death, our father couldn't escape her need to be superior. The lawyer had barely left the office when Ayatollah leaned close to me. Her perfume was heavy and cold, expensive but somehow lifeless. Let's be honest, Adeyemi, she whispered, her voice as smooth as silk sliding over glass. You've never had a head for business. Dad trusted me to take care of things. He told me you'd just waste it all on your simple lifestyle. I turned to look directly at her. He never said that. My voice came out steadier than I felt. She smiled at me the way someone might smile at a confused child. Of course he did. You just weren't around enough to hear it. The hallway outside the office was filled with murmurs from relatives who had attended the will reading. I could hear the scrape of chairs, the smell of coffee drifting in from somewhere, the low hum of conversations pretending not to be about us. Everyone was pretending not to listen, but I knew they were. They were waiting to see what would happen, waiting to pick sides, waiting to gossip about it later at family gatherings. I could have argued with her right there. I could have defended myself, told everyone the truth about how many hours I had spent at our father's bedside. But my father's voice echoed in my head, clear as if he were standing beside me. Never wrestle for respect, son. Let truth breathe on its own. So I said nothing. I just looked at her and stayed silent. That silence only made her bolder, more confident. I'll handle the accounts, she added, slipping her designer sunglasses on even though we were indoors. You'll get your share later, once things settle down and we figure out the proper arrangements. Then she walked away like she owned the air itself, her heels clicking against the marble floor with each confident step. The sound of her heels fading down the corridor felt like a warning, like distant thunder before a storm. I sat there in that echoing hallway for a long time after she left, listening to relatives file out, their whispers bouncing off the walls. Nobody looked at me directly. Nobody asked if I was all right. They all followed Ayatollah like moths drawn to a bright, burning flame. 3 days later, I found her at the family house in Ikoyi, standing on the wide balcony where our father used to sit every evening with his newspaper and tea. She was talking on her phone, laughing too loudly, the way she did when she wanted people to notice her. "Yes, everything's under my name now," she said into the phone, then saw me standing in the doorway and paused mid-sentence. "Adeyemi," she greeted me, pretending warmth that didn't reach her eyes. "I was just finalizing some documents with the legal team. You'll get a copy soon, I promise." Her words tasted like sugar, but her eyes were made of steel. I stepped onto the balcony, feeling the afternoon heat rise from the concrete below. "You changed the lawyer?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and calm. "Just streamlined things," she replied, her lips curling into that familiar half-smile. "Made the process more efficient. You wouldn't understand, Adeyemi. It's all very complex, lots of legal terminology and financial structures." Behind her, the Lagos skyline glowed in the fading sunlight, the same skyline I had once dreamed of conquering when I was young and ambitious. But standing there on that balcony, I felt small again, reduced to the little brother she had always treated like an afterthought. It was like we were children again, and she had stolen the last piece of bread from the table, daring me to say something while knowing I never would. I wanted to remind her of the good times. I wanted to talk about how we had both sat in those sterile hospital corridors, how we had both held our father's weathered hands as he faded, how none of this inheritance was ever meant to divide us. But she turned away mid-sentence, checking her phone with more interest than she had ever shown me. "Ayatollah," I said quietly, choosing my words carefully. "Don't do something you can't undo. Think about what Dad would have wanted." She only smiled at me, that particular smirk that said she had already done exactly what I was warning her against. That smirk said it was already too late, and she knew it, and there was nothing I could do about it. The next morning, my phone buzzed on my nightstand, pulling me from restless sleep. It was a message from the lawyer's office with a subject line that made my stomach drop. "Please review the updated transfer forms." My hands trembled slightly as I opened the attached PDF document. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. Every single asset was listed there in neat, bureaucratic rows. The land in Lekki, the stocks our father had carefully accumulated over decades, the cash accounts, the investment portfolios. Everything was now listed solely under one name, Ayatollah A. Johnson. My name had vanished completely, erased like ink washed from paper, like I had never existed in my father's life at all. I read through the document 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood something, hoping there was an explanation that made sense. But there wasn't. I had been completely written out of my own inheritance. I drove to the law firm immediately, my heart steady but heavy with something that felt like dread mixed with resignation. The clerk met me at the front desk, his face nervous and uncomfortable. He wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Mr. Adeyemi," he said in a low voice, glancing around to make sure nobody else was listening. "There was a last-minute amendment filed just before your father's passing, signed by him personally. I knew that signature. I had seen it my entire life on birthday cards, school permission slips, letters he had written me when I moved away. I knew every curve and loop. But looking at the document the clerk showed me, something was wrong. The loop on the capital A in our family name was too clean, too perfect. My father's handwriting had become shaky in his final months, his hands trembling from medication and weakness. "She forged it," I said softly, more to myself than to the clerk. He looked away quickly, uncomfortable with my accusation. "Sir, if you believe that's true, you'll need to contest it through legal channels. You'll need to file a formal challenge." I felt something heavy settle in my chest. "Can I do that? Do I have grounds?" He hesitated for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Not without concrete proof, sir. Not without evidence that would hold up in court." Outside the law firm, the sun was too bright, too cheerful for how I felt. I stood on the sidewalk listening to traffic rush past, feeling the ground tilt slightly beneath me like the world had shifted off its axis. Somewhere in the noise of car horns and distant conversations, I could still hear her laughter from that balcony, confident and cruel. That evening, I went to her penthouse apartment in Victoria Island. The building had security and marble lobbies, and the kind of expensive emptiness that money creates. She opened the door wearing a silk robe, a champagne glass already in her hand, even though it was barely 6 in the evening. "You're early," she said, completely unbothered by my unannounced arrival. "I wasn't expecting you until later." Her tone suggested she had been expecting me to come eventually, that she had been waiting for this confrontation. "I saw the documents," I said simply. Her perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted in a lazy, unconcerned way. "And you forged Dad's signature," I said, stating it as fact rather than accusation. She laughed then, and it was sharp and beautiful and cruel all at once. "You think I'd risk everything for something like that? Dad wanted me to have control, Adeyemi. He knew you couldn't handle it. You can't even balance your own life properly, much less manage a substantial estate." I stepped closer to her, close enough to see my reflection in her cold eyes. "You're lying," I said quietly. She didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't show even a flicker of guilt or uncertainty. "Prove it," she said simply. Those 2 words landed like a physical slap across my face. Then she turned away from me dismissively, poured more champagne into her crystal glass, and said over her shoulder without even looking at me, "Don't make this ugly, little brother. Be grateful you're not being cut off completely. Some inheritance is better than none." I looked around her penthouse apartment. Marble floors reflected the city lights. Our father's old clock ticked faintly in the corner, the same clock that had sat in his study for 40 years. Seeing it here, in her space, stolen like everything else, made something inside me break and harden at the same time. "Keep it," I said finally, my voice steady and cold. "Keep all of it." For the first time since I had arrived, she looked uncertain. Her confident mask slipped just slightly. But I walked out before she could respond, before she could turn my words into another victory for herself. Her voice followed me down the hallway, soft and mocking. "You'll regret that decision, Adeyemi. You'll regret walking away." I didn't look back. I just kept walking, through her expensive lobby, past the security guard, out into the humid Lagos night where I could finally breathe again. The next morning, I went to the bank where our father had maintained his accounts for over 30 years. The building smelled like disinfectant and old carpet, that particular smell that all banks seem to share. I stood in front of the teller, a young woman who smiled professionally until she looked at her computer screen. Then her smile faded and was replaced by careful concern. She frowned at the screen, then looked up at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. "Mr. Adeyemi," she said carefully, "it seems the joint account has been closed." I blinked, not quite processing her words. "Closed? By whom?" She hesitated, glancing at her supervisor who stood a few desks away. "By the primary holder, Ms. Ayatollah Johnson. The account was closed 3 days ago." For a moment, all the sounds around me blurred together into meaningless noise. Printers humming, footsteps echoing on tile floors, someone laughing at a desk across the hall. My stomach turned cold and heavy. I asked for a printed record, my voice coming from somewhere far away. The teller printed several pages, and I stood there reading through them while other customers moved around me. The transactions were all documented there in black and white, withdrawal after withdrawal, each one larger than the last, ending in a final transfer labeled simply consolidation. 10 million naira. Gone. Transferred completely out of my reach. I folded the papers quietly, thanked the teller, and walked out into the overwhelming heat. The sun hit my face like a physical force. I thought of my father's hands, rough and strong, guiding mine when I was a boy learning to use tools in his workshop. "You don't measure wealth by what you keep, Adeyemi," he used to tell me while we worked. "You measure it by what you can rebuild after everything falls apart." At that moment, standing in that bank parking lot with printed proof of my sister's betrayal, I didn't feel rich or wise. I just felt erased. By the weekend, the family group chat had exploded into chaos. My phone buzzed constantly with messages I didn't want to read but couldn't ignore. My aunt texted, "Adeyemi, how could you fight your sister over money? Your father would be so disappointed in you both." Uncle Kunnel added his opinion. "Your father trusted Ayatollah more with financial matters. Let it go, nephew. Don't tear the family apart over greed." I scrolled through the messages, reading the lies that Ayatollah had already carefully planted throughout our extended family. According to her version of events, I had tried to steal the family assets and was now threatening aggressive legal action. She painted herself as the responsible daughter trying to protect our father's legacy from her unstable, greedy brother. I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in my empty apartment. She had moved faster than I had expected, more strategically than I had given her credit for. When I called my cousin Tund, one of the few people I still trusted, he sighed heavily before even saying hello. She said you've been unstable since the funeral, he told me quietly. She's telling everyone you're not thinking clearly, that grief has made you paranoid. People believe her, bro. You know how she is. She's always been good at this kind of thing. I wanted to defend myself, to shout the truth to everyone who would listen. But what was the point? Truth doesn't need to shout. Truth waits patiently for its moment. That night, I turned off my phone completely. The silence was immediate and almost shocking. The city lights flickered outside my window like 1,000 judgmental eyes, watching me fail, watching me lose everything I had worked for. Everything I had built over the years, my reputation, my relationships with family, the respect I thought I had earned, was slipping away one text message at a time, one lie at a time. A month later, I lost my apartment. The landlord was polite but firm when he knocked on my door. "You've been late with rent twice now, Mr. Adeyemi. I'm sorry, but I need the place back." He said it like he was genuinely sorry, but his eyes said he had already made up his mind. I packed slowly, methodically. Books I had collected over years, a few shirts, my father's watch that he had given me on my 21st birthday. Every box felt heavier than it should have, weighted down with more than just physical objects. I tried calling Ayatollah one final time. The phone rang twice and went straight to voicemail. Her message tone was bright and cheerful. "Hi, you've reached Ayatollah. If this is about the inheritance matter, please contact my lawyer. Otherwise, leave a message, and I'll get back to you when I can." I didn't leave a message. I just sat in the dark apartment for a long time after that, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the steady ticking of the clock my father had given me. It was strange how silence could hurt more than shouting, how absence could cut deeper than any harsh words. But I didn't cry. There was a strange stillness growing inside me, the kind that comes when pain stretches so far and so long that it eventually transforms into something else entirely. Something harder. Something focused. As I packed the last box, I found an old photograph tucked inside a book. It showed me and my father at his workshop, both of us covered in sawdust, laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. He had written something on the back in his careful handwriting. "For when you forget who you are." I ran my fingers over the faded ink, feeling the slight indentations where his pen had pressed into the paper. He had always believed I was the steady one in the family, the one who didn't break even when everything else did. I looked around the empty room, at the bare walls and the boxes stacked by the door, at the life I was leaving behind. Maybe this was what he had meant by that message. Maybe losing everything was how you remembered yourself, how you figured out what you were really made of underneath all the comfort and security. I slipped the photograph carefully into my wallet, where I would see it every day. Then I turned off the lights and walked away from the apartment, not knowing where I was going, just knowing I couldn't stay in a place where my peace had already died. The coastal town of Abesh was small, quiet, almost forgotten by the rush of modern Lagos. Salt hung thick in the air, carried on breezes that smelled like fish and freedom. Palm trees leaned at odd angles like tired soldiers who had been standing guard too long. I rented a small room behind a bakery, cracked walls, one window that looked out at the street, a ceiling fan that rattled like a drum whenever it spun. But the silence in that room felt different from the silence in Lagos. Not empty and judgmental. Healing. I found work at a local accounting office run by a man who asked no questions about my past. The pay was low, barely enough to cover rent and food, but the honesty of the people was worth more than any corporate contract I had reviewed in Lagos. Every night, I would walk to the pier and watch the waves crash against the old wooden posts, over and over, steady and patient and unstoppable. I would stand there and tell myself quietly, "You're still here, Adeyemi. Still breathing. Still standing." It wasn't much of a mantra, but it was enough. It was a start. Abesh moved at its own pace, completely unconcerned with deadlines or competition or ambition. Fishermen shouted at dawn, hauling nets full of silver fish. Children chased crabs along the shore, their laughter echoing off the water. The smell of bread floated through the streets every morning from the bakery below my room, warm and comforting and simple. I kept my head down at work, reviewing ledgers for local traders who still counted cash by hand, who kept their records in worn notebooks rather than computer systems. No one in Abesh cared who I had been in Lagos or what I had lost. They only cared if I was honest, if I showed up on time, if I did my work well. There was something pure about that kind of judgment, something refreshing after years of being evaluated on status and connections and family name. For the first time in months, I slept through the entire night without waking up in cold sweats. Sometimes I would sit by the ocean after work, watching the horizon fade from blue to orange to purple, and think about how 10 million naira had vanished from my life. But the sound of the sea cost nothing, required nothing, judged nothing. And somehow, sitting there on those old wooden boards with my feet dangling over the water, I felt like I owned something real for the first time. Something that couldn't be stolen or forged or taken away. One evening, an elderly man walked into the accounting office. He was an expatriate named Mr. Rowan, who ran a small shipping business nearby. He had sharp eyes that seemed to see through pretense, but his tone was kind when he spoke. "You're new here," he said, not as a question but as an observation. "You don't talk much, do you?" I looked up from the ledger I was reviewing. "I'm just grateful to be working, sir." He studied me for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "Gratitude is good, son. But don't confuse silence with humility. There's a difference between being humble and making yourself small." That line stayed with me long after he left the office. Over the following weeks, Mr. Rowan started inviting me to his house for tea in the evenings. We would sit on his porch overlooking the water, and he would talk about business ethics, about integrity, about how greed always reveals itself, eventually even when it seems to be winning. He didn't know my story, didn't know about Ayatollah, or the inheritance, or the forged signatures. But somehow, in those evening conversations over simple tea, he was teaching me how to live through it all better, how to rebuild not just my circumstances, but my sense of self-worth. 6 months after I arrived in Abesh, Mr. Rowan asked me to handle his company's finances. "I need someone I can trust," he said simply. "And I think you need something to believe in again." I hesitated, the old fear rising up. "Why me, sir? You barely know me." He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Because you don't chase power, young man. You understand it, but you don't chase it. That's rare. That's valuable." Working for him was different from anything I had experienced before. It was calm, purposeful, built on mutual respect rather than competition or hierarchy. He gave me full access to his company books, trusted me with sensitive information, relied on my judgment. For the first time since my father's will had been read in that tense conference room, someone trusted me without question or suspicion. That trust became my new currency, more valuable than any amount of money. My days fell into a comfortable rhythm. Sunrise coffee while watching fishermen prepare their boats. Work until late afternoon reviewing accounts and helping local businesses. Dinner with neighbors who invited me to their simple homes. Long walks by the sea as the sun set and the stars emerged. I no longer thought about the money constantly. Sometimes, though, I would see a luxury car drive through town, probably lost tourists trying to find their way back to the main highway, and I would feel a flicker of old anger. I would remember the life I had lost, the house in Ikoyi that should have been partially mine, the financial security that had been stolen. But then I would remember Ayatollah's voice that day in her penthouse. "You didn't earn it." Maybe she was right in a strange, twisted way. I hadn't earned that inheritance. It had been given to me by birth, by luck, by my father's love. But I was earning my peace now, day by day, choice by choice. And peace, I was learning, doesn't come in millions of naira. It comes in quiet mornings and honest work, and the respect of people who have no reason to lie to you. One evening at the bakery where I rented my room, the owner was scrolling through her tablet while I ate my simple dinner of bread and tea. Suddenly she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Isn't this your sister?" she asked, turning the screen toward me. There she was, Ayatollah, smiling brilliantly for a business magazine cover. The headline read, "The woman behind Lagos' fastest-growing luxury brand." She looked flawless in the photograph, powerful and successful and completely in control. I stared at the photo for a long time, feeling a small ache pull at my chest. But I didn't hate her anymore. The burning anger that had once consumed me had cooled into something quieter, something closer to pity. "I hope it's worth it," I whispered, then went back to my bread and tea. Some battles, I had learned, don't need witnesses. They just need distance. It started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. "Mr. Adeyemi?" The voice on the other end was nervous, speaking quickly. "This is Kunal. I used to work for your sister's company. I froze, my hand tightening on the phone. What do you want from me? He hesitated, and I could hear traffic noise in the background like he was calling from somewhere public. You should see what's happening in Lagos. Things aren't right. Her company, there's a government investigation. Financial irregularities. I thought you should know. He hung up abruptly before I could ask any questions. That night, I sat by the ocean while the wind howled like it knew secrets I didn't. The waves crashed harder than usual, angry and insistent. I told myself I didn't care what happened to Ayatollah anymore, that I had moved past all of that. But deep down, a strange mixture of curiosity and something that felt uncomfortably like justice began to stir inside me. The next morning, I found the news online. The headline made me read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Authorities probe Ayatollah Adewale's company over alleged fraud and mismanagement. I stared at my phone screen for a long time, the words blurring slightly. So this was the price of greed. This was karma finally catching up. The article mentioned irregular financial transfers, false accounting practices, and most damning of all, inheritance assets used as collateral without proper authorization. My heart sank, not out of pity exactly, but out of disbelief. She had used parts of our father's legacy to build her empire. Money that was meant to honor his memory. She had gambled with it, risked it, used it as leverage for her own ambitions. It had never really been hers to use that way. Mr. Rowan found me sitting at my desk, staring at nothing. You knew her? He asked softly, somehow understanding without me saying anything. Yes, I said quietly. Better than most people. Worse than I thought I did. A week later, an envelope arrived at the accounting office where I worked. There was no sender name, just my address written in handwriting I hadn't seen in years, but recognized immediately. I almost threw it away without opening it, but something made me pause. I opened it carefully and pulled out a single sheet of expensive stationery. Dear Adeyemi, it began. They're saying terrible things about me. None of it is true. The media is lying. The investigators are biased. Please, if you still have any compassion left, any memory of us being family, help me explain to them what really happened. I need you. Ayatollah. I folded the letter quietly and placed it back in the envelope. She wanted my help now. The same woman who had called me unworthy, who had erased my name from our father's will, who had stolen everything and laughed about it. I set the envelope aside without responding. Some debts can't be repaid with letters and desperate pleas. She came to Abesh 2 days later. I was working late when I looked up and saw her standing in the doorway of my small office. Same elegant clothes, same perfect posture, but her eyes were completely different. Where there had once been confidence and cruelty, now there was fear. Real, genuine fear. Adeyemi, she said, her voice small in a way I had never heard before. I didn't know where else to go. I motioned for her to sit in the chair across from my desk. She looked around the simple office with obvious surprise, taking in the cracked walls, the ancient filing cabinets, the single window looking out at a narrow street. You've changed, she whispered, and it sounded almost like an accusation. No, I replied calmly. I just stopped pretending to be something I wasn't. For the first time in our lives, she looked small sitting there. Fragile, even. And for the first time, I didn't feel burning anger when I looked at her. I just felt distance, like she was a stranger I used to know. She told me everything then, words tumbling out in a desperate rush. How her investors had turned on her when the news broke. How forged documents had been traced back to her CFO, who was now cooperating with authorities. How the government had frozen all her accounts, seized her assets, destroyed everything she had built. She talked for almost an hour while I listened in silence, and I watched her carefully constructed world crumble in real time. But the biggest shock came at the very end of her confession. The lawyer handling the investigation, she said, her voice trembling, he found something in father's personal files. Something that was hidden in his safe at the house. I frowned. What did he find? She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. There's another version of the will, Adeyemi. A second will that no one knew about. My heart started beating faster. Another will? I repeated carefully. She nodded, tears now streaming down her perfect makeup. One that changes everything we thought we knew. I didn't speak. I couldn't. I just sat there feeling the tide of fate turning again, slow and cold and utterly unstoppable. The storm that had destroyed my life months ago wasn't finished yet. It had been building toward this moment all along. The storm, it seemed, wasn't done with either of us yet. Not by a long way. The lawyer's office smelled exactly the same as it had months ago when this nightmare had begun: polished wood and hidden secrets. He placed a worn envelope on the table between us and sighed deeply. "This document was found in your father's personal safe," he explained, adjusting his glasses. "It predates the will we read to you both by almost a year." My pulse quickened as he carefully unfolded the yellowed paper. Ayatollah sat rigid beside me, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. The lawyer read slowly. "Should circumstances arise that reveal misuse of my estate or betrayal of family trust, I entrust the remaining assets to my son Adeyemi, the one who values peace over pride, integrity over inheritance." The words hung in the air like smoke. I watched Ayatollah's face drain of all color, watched her eyes widen with the full realization of what this meant. For a moment, I felt genuinely sorry for her. Not because she was losing the money, but because she had lost herself so completely long before this day ever arrived. News of the second will broke within days. Her name trended on social media, in newspapers, on gossip blogs. The fall of Ayatollah Adewale became a headline that followed her everywhere. Her company was officially shut down. Her business partners vanished, distancing themselves as quickly as possible. I watched the headlines roll in from my small office in Abesh, each one like a chapter of a story finally reaching its conclusion. People expected me to celebrate, to gloat, to take satisfaction in her downfall. But I didn't feel any of those things. I just stood by my window looking out at the ocean and whispered quietly, "Dad, I hope you're resting easy now. I hope you found your peace." The money, the house in Ikoyi, the control over the estate, none of it mattered to me any more the way it once had. All I wanted was peace, and somehow, standing in that small room above a bakery in a forgotten coastal town, I finally had it. Weeks later, she came to Abesh again. No luxury car this time, no designer handbag, no expensive sunglasses. Just silence and shame. She stood at the doorway of my office, the same spot where this final chapter had begun. "I lost everything," she said simply. "Even myself." I nodded slowly. "Maybe that's the start of something new for you. Maybe that's where real life begins." She looked at me with eyes red from crying. "You're not angry anymore, are you?" "No," I said softly, and I meant it completely. "Anger is too heavy to carry, Ayatollah. I don't have the strength for it anymore." For the first time in years, since we were children before ambition and greed had poisoned everything, she smiled. It was small and tired and achingly human. Then she turned and left, and I let her go without hate, without bitterness, without anything except hope that she might find her own path eventually. A week later, the lawyer called with the final details. "All assets are legally yours now, Mr. Adeyemi. The full 10 million naira, plus the properties, plus the investment accounts. Everything your father left behind." I thanked him politely, but I didn't rush to the bank. I didn't start planning how to spend it. Instead, I set up a foundation in my father's name. Scholarships for children who had lost parents early, support for families struggling with medical bills, programs to teach financial literacy to young people who had never learned. Redemption, I had learned, wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about getting.